The deep-seated hope that someone will fundamentally change, particularly within the context of a relationship that feels both intensely captivating and profoundly destabilizing, is a natural human inclination. It's not necessarily born out of naivety or a refusal to acknowledge harsh realities, but rather from a genuine recognition of a rare and compelling essence within the other person. You've likely witnessed moments where a remarkable vulnerability shone through, a rawness that felt authentic and deeply touching. This was accompanied by a palpable connection, a spark of chemistry so potent it felt irrefutable. There were undoubtedly times when you felt unequivocally loved, truly seen, and that your presence held significant meaning for her. Yet, these experiences are often followed by an unsettling metamorphosis, a shift so dramatic it leaves you feeling as though you are now navigating an entirely different dynamic, interacting with a stranger who bears only a passing resemblance to the person you thought you knew. This bewildering inconsistency is a hallmark of relationships with individuals exhibiting narcissistic or similar personality traits, and understanding the underlying reasons for this lack of sustained positive change is crucial for anyone trapped in such a cycle. Over the next approximately 12 minutes, we will delve into 7 key reasons why a partner exhibiting narcissistic tendencies is exceptionally unlikely to undergo lasting, positive transformation. Please remain engaged until the conclusion, for I will then share a profound and often difficult truth that many are reluctant to confront. The first significant impediment to improvement in these relationships stems from the profound lack of continuity between the various personas your partner presents. When you are involved with someone who displays narcissistic or borderline tendencies, it is almost inevitable that you will encounter at least 3 distinct and often contradictory versions of them. There is the initial, intensely warm, engaging, charming, and deeply connected persona, the version that likely captivated you during the love bombing or idealization phase. Sadly, after this initial period, this radiant aspect of their personality is often reserved for public consumption, a performance designed to elicit admiration from the outside world. Then, there exists a vulnerable, almost childlike iteration, a persona that elicits a desire to nurture and protect. Finally, and most devastatingly, there is the critical, controlling, punishing, jealous, and often rage-filled counterpart. The disconcerting aspect of these distinct versions is their apparent lack of interrelation. They seem to exist in separate universes, never acknowledging or influencing one another. Consider a concrete example. You might experience an evening of exceptional intimacy and connection. You share laughter, engage in meaningful conversation, and she showers you with praise, perhaps declaring you the best thing that has ever happened to her. The intimacy might be profound, leading you to believe you have finally achieved a stable and loving connection. However, this idyllic state can be shattered by the slightest provocation. A minor transgression, perhaps a simple question posed by you, a trivial oversight such as placing an item in the wrong refrigerator shelf, or even a moment of politeness towards a server, can trigger an instantaneous and drastic shift. She can flip from adoring partner to accusatory critic in an instant, transforming you from hero to zero without warning. The admiration and affection you experienced just moments before vanish as if they were never real, leaving you bewildered and under attack, embroiled in arguments that defy logic and reason. The charming, loving individual from earlier has seemingly evaporated, leaving you to contend with an entirely different and often hostile personality. As time progresses, you will find yourself witnessing this positive version with increasing in frequency, further eroding your sense of stability and connection within the relationship. This jarring discontinuity between her presented selves makes genuine, lasting intimacy and trust virtually impossible to cultivate, as you are constantly left guessing which version of your partner you will encounter next and what actions might precipitate a negative shift. A second, and perhaps more insidious reason for the stagnation and eventual deterioration of these relationships lies in your tendency to believe that the vulnerable version of your partner is her authentic self, leading you to spend the remainder of your time together perpetually awaiting her return. This particular facet of her personality, the one that appeared so open, soft, and in desperate need of your love and protection, made you feel indispensable and vital. Those moments felt so genuine, so raw and unvarnished, that they solidified your perception of her true core identity, Consequently, when confronted with her other, less desirable traits, the incessant criticism, the controlling behaviors, the alarming way she can turn on you, her public amiability juxtaposed with private hostility, you do not perceive these as indicators of her genuine self. Instead, you dismiss them as isolated incidents, fleeting bad moments. You attribute her behavior to past traumas, rationalizing her actions, and continually affording her the benefit of the doubt, clinging to the belief that the real her is just beneath the surface, waiting to re-emerge. This deeply ingrained belief compels you to invest even more time, effort, and emotional energy, driven by the fear that if you disengage now, another individual will swiftly step in and secure that coveted, good version of her for themselves permanently. The harsh reality, however, is that this outcome is highly improbable. The individual who follows you will likely find themselves ensnared in the same cyclical pattern of hope and disappointment, mirroring the experiences of every partner who came before and every partner who will follow. The dynamic does not improve. In fact, it invariably intensifies in its negative aspects over time, leaving you further entrenched in a cycle of unfulfilled expectations and emotional exhaustion. Your persistent belief in her underlying goodness, however well-intentioned, becomes a potent force that perpetuates the very cycle you are desperately trying to escape. This unwavering faith in a potential future where she is consistently her best self blinds you to the present reality and the consistent patterns of behavior that indicate a lack of genuine, sustainable change. The third critical factor contributing to the lack of positive evolution in these relationships is the transactional nature of your perceived value. In essence, your worth and standing within the relationship are perpetually tied to what you are currently providing. This supply can manifest in various forms: unwavering attention, financial resources, practical assistance, or emotional labor. At its core, it represents your willingness and capacity to meet her demands and needs on demand, without complaint or hesitation. As long as you are fulfilling this role as a consistent supplier, you may experience temporary periods of peace and relative harmony. However, this equilibrium is exceptionally fragile. The moment you falter, the instant you express a need of your own, say no, cease overfunctioning, or fail to meet an expectation, the dynamic can pivot with alarming speed. You are swiftly recast from provider to antagonist. Suddenly, you become the selfish one, and all your past contributions and good deeds are conveniently forgotten. They cease to hold any relevance in the present moment. Your prior generosity is dismissed, and you are accused of not caring, of being self-centered. In a cruel twist, she may even label you a narcissist, a projection that serves to deflect from her own behaviors and maintain her position of victimhood. This creates a profound trap. You entered the relationship with the sincere intention of building a loving partnership, only to discover that your role is often reduced to that of a resource provider. The instant you stop supplying, your value plummets, and to her, you may become, in that moment, effectively nothing. This constant precariousness, where your acceptance is conditional upon your ongoing utility, prevents the development of a secure and authentic connection. The absence of unconditional regard means that true intimacy, built on mutual vulnerability and acceptance, cannot flourish. Your value is merely a reflection of your current output, and any deviation from that output triggers a rapid de-escalation of her regard. The fourth and equally devastating reason why these relationships are destined to remain stagnant, if not actively deteriorate, is the relentless externalization of her shame. These relationships often commence with an intoxicating intensity, a whirlwind of passion and connection that can feel unprecedented. However, at a certain juncture, you invariably transition from being perceived as the ideal partner to becoming the perfect problem. She will begin to accuse and blame you for an ever-increasing array of issues. Initially, assuming that her complaints must stem from genuine problems, you will diligently attempt to rectify them. Yet, you will eventually reach a point of profound realization. The problems are relentless, an endless cycle of perceived faults. This persistent lack of resolution is not because you are the actual source of the difficulties. The underlying unacknowledged issue is her profound internal shame, which she compulsively projects outward. For individuals exhibiting strong narcissistic or borderline traits, Shame is an overwhelming and unbearable emotion. Their psyche often employs a defense mechanism of externalization, pushing these intolerable feelings onto others to avoid confronting them directly. Once her shame is projected onto you and inextricably linked to your identity, and crucially, if you begin to internalize this projection and believe you are indeed the cause of her distress, the relationship fundamentally ceases to grow. Instead, it begins to unravel. From her perspective, the sole impediment to a harmonious relationship now resides with you. This externalization serves as a powerful defense, allowing her to maintain a facade of righteousness while evading the arduous and painful work of self-examination and accountability. Your efforts to understand and resolve these projected issues are ultimately futile, as the root cause lies within her, and she is unwilling or unable to address it directly. The relationship becomes a battleground where you are perpetually fighting shadows, tasked with resolving problems that originate not from your actions, but from her internal emotional landscape. The fifth crucial reason why these relationships are unlikely to see any meaningful improvement is that the entire structure rests precariously on your shoulders. You are the sole architect and engineer holding it together. This is a particularly difficult aspect for many to confront, as it necessitates acknowledging your own role in perpetuating the dynamic. The stability, however illusory, of this relationship is a direct consequence of your continuous efforts. You are the one perpetually adjusting your demeanor, meticulously managing your tone of voice, shrinking yourself to avoid triggering her negative reactions, and tolerating behaviors that, in any healthy context, would warrant significant consequences. Consider the implications of this sustained effort. What would happen if you were to cease absorbing all the blame, the shame, and the inherent chaos? The immediate aftermath would likely be a dramatic escalation of the dysfunction. You would witness an increase in rage, more severe forms of punishment, an amplification of contempt, and a pronounced display of victimhood. The relationship, in its current form, would very likely collapse. This is because your ongoing efforts to maintain peace and equilibrium are, paradoxically, what are actively reinforcing and sustaining the dysfunction. As long as you continue to absorb, accommodate, and tolerate, there is no impetus for her to change. In fact, some of the very behaviors that inflict harm upon you are being inadvertently rewarded and reinforced by your continued acceptance and appeasement. Therefore, if your boundaries would inherently destabilize the relationship, then it is your ongoing self-betrayal, your willingness to compromise your own well-being, that is likely providing the semblance of stability. This realization is a painful one, as it highlights how your attempts to salvage the relationship might be precisely what is preventing its genuine evolution, or a necessary, albeit difficult, conclusion. The absence of healthy boundaries on your part creates an environment where maladaptive behaviors can persist unchallenged, leaving you trapped in a cycle of emotional compromise. The sixth and equally potent reason why these relationships resist positive change is her fundamental and often unyielding inability to accept accountability. Without the capacity to own one's actions and their consequences, genuine growth and healing are impossible. We are speaking here of the ability to sincerely utter phrases like, "I was wrong," "I hurt you," and "that was my responsibility," and to hold that truth without resorting to blame shifting, creating excuses, or turning the narrative back onto you. Within the confines of such a relationship, you will discover that this crucial element is consistently absent. Should you by some rare chance receive an apology, it is rarely sustained. It invariably devolves back into a narrative where you are once again positioned as the victim and she as the wronged party. Consequently, if nothing is ever truly owned or acknowledged on her side, and the burden of responsibility perpetually falls upon you, then the very foundation for change is absent, ensuring that the relationship remains in its current unhealthy state. This pattern of deflection and refusal to accept responsibility prevents any possibility of learning from mistakes, fostering genuine remorse, or making amends. It creates an environment where the same hurtful patterns are doomed to repeat, as the individual responsible never truly grapples with their impact. The absence of accountability is not merely an inconvenience, it is a critical barrier that prevents the development of trust, respect, and a healthy, reciprocal partnership. It ensures that the dynamic remains perpetually unbalanced, with one party consistently bearing the weight of the relationship's shortcomings. The seventh and final reason that nothing in this relationship improves is rooted in a profound lack of desire for change or an outright rejection of help. Many individuals find themselves clinging to the notion that if only their partner would seek therapy, then perhaps the relationship could be salvaged and find a path toward healing. This is a common point of entrapment, as the reality is that sometimes she genuinely does not want help, nor does she believe she requires any change herself. In other instances, she might engage with therapy, only to return and assert that the therapist concurs with her assessment that you are the problem. In such cases, therapy, intended as a tool for healing, inadvertently exacerbates the situation, reinforcing her narrative of victimhood and your perceived culpability. Let us be unequivocally clear. True change requires undertaking deep, often uncomfortable internal work and persevering through that process, especially when it becomes challenging, which it inevitably will. Some individuals are simply unwilling to tolerate this level of introspection and discomfort. She may actively resist therapeutic intervention, or she may utilize it as a means of validating her existing beliefs and grievances. The moment she is confronted with the necessity of genuine self-examination or the possibility of her own responsibility, she may abandon the process entirely. Therefore, if she consistently refuses to engage in the necessary work, or if she has been involved in therapy for years, and you continue to witness the same destructive patterns replaying themselves, then that is your definitive answer. This situation may be as good as it is ever going to get. Consequently, you are compelled to ask yourself a profoundly honest question. Can you genuinely accept her and the relationship as it currently exists, precisely as it is, with all its flaws and limitations? This question forces a direct confrontation with the reality of the situation, unvarnished by hope for future transformation.